Well, welcome back to another edition of Mic Drop here, made possible by the Believe Network, available everywhere you get your podcasts, and also, as well as other podcasts with Believe, broadcast on various Sirius XM channels. I'm Mike Asti, and I am back. Took a little hiatus there, took a week-long family vacation, so I am now back, as this show is now back with another edition of Mic Drop, and this one will focus in on college football. So we'll go wall-to-wall college football. Have not talked college football on this show in a while, even though we are now fast approaching a new season. We are nearing fall camp. I don't want to ruin your summer, spoil your summer, and speed up the summer by any means, but we're moving along. And preseason lists, preseason All-American list, projections. My guest for this show has already released a bowl game projection. And yeah, bowl games. We're talking about the holiday season and into the new year. He's already talking about which team's going to play in those and where he sees the playoff standing. My colleagues among Big 12 media and all of college football media throughout the country are revving up as well. So I am going to focus on, and my guest is going to focus on, the region that I cover. So we are going to talk West Virginia, the WVU Mountaineers, the Pitt Panthers, and also the Penn State Nittany Lions, and dive into what my guest expects from these teams, what maybe is holding him back on some projections for these teams, what he likes, what he doesn't like about these teams, who's under the most pressure this coming season, and we will get into all of that with my guest for this edition of Mic Drop with Bill Bender of the Sporting News. We've talked to him pretty much every year I've done this show on my own about what's going on throughout the college football landscape and what to expect this coming season. So happy to have him back. Bill, how has your summer been so far? You're clearly knee-deep already into projecting the new season here, as we're only sitting early into July.
Fast. The summer goes by fast. I mean, we're already into July. June went very quick. The kids are out of school, and before you know it, they'll be right back in it, and we'll be into week 0. So, we've leaked out some of our preseason content, bowl projections. We'll do full conference predictions later, but I just keep reminding, this is a new year. Yeah. It's going to be a lot that is new in college football, and a lot of questions like, how's this thing going to work? That's what we're going to find out.
Yeah, not only do we have a 12-team playoff, which many have wanted for a while, even though I have argued we should get to 8 first. We have a whole new landscape around the country. Conference realignment has now shaken things up yet again. Texas and Oklahoma, they're gone from the Big 12. New teams coming in, and that's just talking the Big 12. Obviously, the Pac-12 no more. The Big 10 is just basically an NFL-style conference. A lot going on, and all of that does come into play this year. We've known about a lot of this for a while. We've been talking about a lot of this for a while, and we did see a shakeup a decade ago, but now we are here, and I'm sure we're going to see more shakeups in the next decade, but this 2024 season, as you're putting it, does mark a barometer shift of the college sports, but namely college football landscape overall. No matter where we get 50 years from now, this season is going to be that first of this new era. And we're not going to discuss it here, but some almost call this a new era where the student athlete college, in terms of college football, is really no more. This is now really officially almost professional sports, free agency, NIL, transfer portal. It's been around, but this year with the shift really shows that it is really there for the future, and a lot of what we've known for years is taking place this year. So, Bill, as you did kind of tease, you did, and I did too, you did drop some bowl projections. More will come, but I do want to kind of start there, and I will start with the team that I cover directly, the West Virginia Mountaineers, a team that when we talked a season ago, it was, how are they going to possibly win 5 games? A bowl game seems laughable. Neil Brown's going to be the first coach to get fired. And this was the commentary with any guest I would have on. I thought they could crawl into a bowl game maybe. I didn't know if that would keep Brown, but they proved a lot of us wrong. They won 9 games. You could argue, if you look at these games and dissected them, and I covered them all, They should have won more. They blew that game to Houston with the Hail Mary at the end. Green keeps his helmet on. They probably hold on to win that game. Oklahoma State, they allowed Ollie Gordon to run for 150 in the fourth quarter alone. If he runs for a little bit less, they probably end up holding on and winning that game. And then who knows, even before this 12-team playoff. They do come off the 9-4 year in a bowl win. And now many fans are saying, well, with the new landscape, historically speaking, they're the winningest program now in the Big 12. Neil Brown has a new deal. It kind of is friendly. There's more NIL money there. Everyone's happy. The vibes and atmosphere, it's all better there. Yeah, Zach Frazier's gone, but this team could contend for a Big 12 title. That's what Neil Brown's saying. That's what they're selling. They're basically making it clear if they crawl into a bowl game, that's a disappointing year now for this team. But I saw your projection. That's exactly what you're kind of saying they're going to do. You have them in the Guaranteed Rate Bowl. You have them playing Rutgers. We put it on the site. That, I would assume, would be a max of 7 wins. Like, that's not going to be what fans think they're going to do or what they're dreaming. So I ask you, why are you not buying what Neil Brown and the Mountaineers are selling? Why are you kind of pumping the brakes on the Mountaineers? Why do you see them still getting into only a minor bowl game? And what kind of is holding you back from feeling like the Mountaineers could take that next step and go from 9 to double-digit victories, get a conference title, the first for them as a Big 12 champ?
Well, I mean, the Big 12 is wide open now. It's a different Big 12 now. And look who they brought in. Now they don't play Utah, but early in the season, they got to play at Arizona.
And Utah's the preseason Big 12 media pick, by the way.
They will be, yeah. And I saw.
Well, that was released today. They are,
yeah. I saw that this morning. That doesn't surprise me. Utah's the safest pick, and
sure,
the Big 12 is very wide open. But I mean, West Virginia caught a tough schedule as far as this is concerned. You know, they've got to play. Not only is their non-league tough with Penn State, but look at the first 5 Big 12 games will tell you everything. They're playing Kansas. Kansas, when Jalen Daniels was on the field, is really tough. They're playing at Oklahoma State. Ollie Gordon, obviously, off-season arrest this week, but he'll be on the field in that game.
You'd imagine.
Kansas State, Arizona back-to-back, and Iowa State. At least they're coming from Morgantown for that one. Yeah, I mean, that's brutal. And I think West Virginia is probably getting the least attention of the darts that you could throw as a Big 12 favorite. Now
they're 7th based on all the teams you mentioned are ahead of them, either just barely or obviously some of them way ahead. And Kansas State's in there, Oklahoma State's in there. They're the top 3 with Utah.
That's the 7 darts that you're looking at now.
Right?
Can West Virginia compete with that? Sure. You know, Garrett Green's a guy that really did well last year. He's a dual threat. He's not a Tebow type, but I mean, what he offers in the running game is good. And you have top 3 leading rushers back, good offensive line, Neil Brown system. Like you said, I would love to hear the playback of what I said on here last year. I was probably one of those guys that was trying to say, okay, 6 or 7 wins constitutes a good season.
Yeah.
Surpass that. I'm guessing that's what I said on here.
Yeah, I think you did in our projection too. And that's kind of where I was, because the schedule was arguably even tougher last year. They had to go to Penn State. This year, at least they have the Nittany Lions at home. We didn't know Pitt would be as bad as they were when we were talking last year, and they ended up having a 3-win season. So out of conference, you could argue was even tougher last year for the Mountaineers. They had UCF was a game they did win, but that was on the road that people thought was a swing game. So 7 wins seemed like with a tough schedule. Preseason wise, I believe it was on the top 15, top 10 toughest schedule in the country. WVU has a hard schedule this year, but some are not putting it there because the end of the year, which you did not mention, if they end up in a situation where they can hold water to the middle of the season and be tied with some of these teams, they have an easy slate at the end. They could roll off and win 3 or 4 in a row at the end of the year. So that is something that maybe is allowing people to be optimistic about WVU. But I think, we both were kind of 6, 7. They won 9. And as I said, if it wasn't for the penalty with Green taking his helmet off, that's basically another win, because as bad as they played, it's hard to believe that Houston converts a Hail Mary 15 yards further back. So we all were way wrong. I mean, they were the over-under sports books had them at 4.5 wins over-under. So, but the same sports books have them at 6.5 this year, which I imagine is kind of where you are. It seems like. Again,
7, 8. They get to 7 and 5. Now, again, when you do bowl projections, those are a matrix of
right.
I had to go in and correct something, actually, because I had Kansas in 2 bowl games because when I was switching all these Big 12 teams around, and that's not out of the realm of the possibility in 2024 that they would, but I had deleted Arizona. So there's somebody that admits his mistakes on the air.
Yeah, well, thank you.
And they're very rare quality I have. Yeah. And, but that Big 12 grinder is tough. I think this conference is positioned to be a little bit better football-wise than the ACC right now. Now, they may not have the power at the top with the Florida State, Clemson.
Yeah.
But when you can say here on July 2nd or 3rd that Arizona, Kansas State, Oklahoma State, Kansas, UCF, West Virginia, any one of those teams could win it, then it would strengthen the case for having a second playoff team.
Yeah. And is it just the schedule, or is there something else with WVU? And the reason why I asked that, yes, they did win 9 last year, and yes, Garrett Green played well. They also won games when he was out because the defense played with their hair on fire that I don't think anyone thought or would think again that if Green misses time, they're just going to clip off wins without him. But they did, and Green should be better with another year under his belt. The coaching staff has said, though, that the issue for Green, despite being explosive and being the dual threat, 52.9% completion percentage, and I have that for some reason memorized in my head. They all have said he has to be 60% around that area to contend for a Big 12 title. Neil Brown has said this. The coaches have said this. National media has said this. That's a kind of a jump from 52.9 to go all the way to 60, and yet these same people are saying they could contend for the Big 12. Is there something about the team that maybe you're thinking like that can't happen? Green's who he is. That would be a bizarre jump. Is there something on as far as the team that they're just not as good as some are thinking, or is it that the schedule is a little bit tougher in terms of those swing games are now going to be on the road, so they could actually be an 8-win team that ends up 5th or 6th because of the depth of the conference and be good, but be under now expectations of what the program's trying to sell?
Well, the back end, when you're relying on transfers in the secondary in a conference where teams throw it around, and this defense still allowed 26 points per game. And, we're going to talk about Pitt here. I have a stat on Pitt so West Virginia was 4-4 when allowing 21 points or more last year.
Okay. And
that you're going to give up more than 21 points when you're facing the quarterbacks that they're going to face this year, and they didn't even get, it'd been interesting to see WVU play Colorado or WVU play Utah with Cam Rising, but you're getting Kansas State likes their quarterback. Noah Fafita is good. Oklahoma State has 5 offensive linemen back. I mentioned Jalen Daniels in Kansas. So they're going to, and KJ Jefferson's UCF's quarterback, by the way. He's played a ton of football. So
Daniels gave him a lot of problems 2 seasons ago. That was kind of the coming out party for Daniels is against West Virginia after losing the Pitt game. He just did whatever he wanted.
Right. So I think that'll be interesting to see how that defense reacts to being in those high score. So basically what we're saying is you give up around 28 points, it becomes a 50-50 game. And, I'm sure West Virginia is going to be in a couple of those this year.
Yeah, and you figure, and I think what maybe again is an optimistic view, I guess you could argue, is say they're in those 50-50 games, because the defense probably will be what it was last year. Maybe he might even take a step back, but Beanie Bishop wasn't supposed to do what he did last year where he became an All-American. It wasn't like everyone was projecting that. He did end up becoming an All-American. That helped out all those numbers. They were right up there in ball hawk rate. But as the defensive coaches will tell you, when you're up there in ball hawk rate, but you're in the middle of the pack in actual turnovers, you're missing a lot. So to actually win the Big 12, they probably got to actually convert a lot more of those turnovers, get more of those picks. They won the brawl-off picks last year. They might have to do that, win a couple games like that coming up this season. And then offensively, the optimistic view would be that even if the defense does not improve and is kind of the same secondary-wise and they don't get more turnovers, that Green and the offense should be better. Green has another season under his belt, so should be more accurate, should now be smarter with the football off the growing pains he learned last year, like that Houston loss. And the wide receiver room is way deeper. So they bring in Justin Robinson from Mississippi State. You bring in Jaden Bray from Oklahoma State, plucking off a Big 12 foe. You have Traylon Ray that no one expected. This will be a sophomore year from him. He's explosive. Gallagher may play offense, defense, but Hudson Clement emerge. Preston Fox is still there. Jaheim White. And they kept C.J. Donaldson despite White emerging. Many thought that he would be gone but they have both of them. So that's more weapons than before, and they're all more experienced. If the offense is better than it was last year, even if the defense is not, they should be able to score more. So then you're flipping 28 points you're giving up in a swing game. Maybe they can score 30 a game and barely crawl into those being victories.
Yeah, and that's going to be the thing, that when you get in those games, you got to count on that. You got to count on your pass rush, things like that. I'm excited to watch Big 12 football for all of those reasons. And when you get in those games, obviously with that style of play, pass rush will be key. They didn't have a player with more than 4.5 sacks last season. So I'm interested to see how that goes. But I know from a Big 12 standpoint that style of play is going to be something to watch, and against those quarterbacks. And how much does home field matter? I always watch that. Mountaineer Field is going to be a first time for some teams in the near future. Maybe not this year, right? They don't catch a Big 12 or a Pac-12 team for the first time there, correct? So they don't play Colorado, or
they don't play Colorado. No, they don't.
Any of the new ones. They don't play the new ones at Mountaineer Field. So yeah, but I mean, if they can wiggle into the Big 12 championship game, and if they can get there, one thing that's really interesting, I'm not ducking the question, but let's say they had 3 losses and won the Big 12 championship. I think the Big 12 champion could have 3 losses and get in the playoff.
Well, I mean, this is going to be the debate, and I actually have said this, especially I think this could be an issue, Bill, for West Virginia. And by the way, talking with Bill Bender here of the Sporting News on Mic Drop, we're going through college football, some projections. We're going to talk an ACC and a Big Ten team coming up there with Pitt and Penn State within this same market, but right now talking the Mountaineers. West Virginia plays 3 out-of-conference games, obviously, as the Big 12 teams do. Some other conferences play 4. ACC plays 4. 2 of those 3 are now Power 4 programs. They've been playing more power programs out of conference. We talked a lot about this last year on how the West Virginia slide is all about they did the schedule wrong. They stacked these rivals up power conference teams, whereas everyone else is playing an FCS and a group of 5. They played 2 power teams. And Neil Brown and Ren Baker have complained about this. Next year, not this 2024 season, but 2025 is when Ren Baker really gets a hold of the schedule to change a lot of that. So you're going to see probably just 1 power out of conference team. But this year, you still have Pitt and Penn State there with Albany mixed in. So figuring Albany is a victory, they have 2 out of conference power teams in there. Even if you're not high on Pitt, Penn State's there. It is at home, but it's still freaking Penn State. There's a possibility, Bill. The way it works, you win the conference, which is just about what you do in the conference. You're in the playoff, and you're in as a high seed. People are going to argue this isn't fair to certain conferences are tougher than others, etc. West Virginia could go into conference play at 1 and 2, lose both power rival out-of-conference games, and if they win these swing games, win this Big 12, which is still going to be a crapshoot probably and wide open, they could get in the playoff as a high seed, win the Big 12, and lose to both Pitt and Penn State. It is possible to do that. It would look really crappy, and I think that would start a debate on if Big 12 should keep on getting this automatic spot, if they should give the seeds automatically being a high seed to a conference champ, etc., because there's going to be an SEC team there that's going to probably be way better than West Virginia in rankings of everywhere else, but then not be where WVU is in seeding. But at the end of the day, that is the current format. That is the current rules. And they could get in that way as a top seed despite losing out of conference games. It is possible.
Yeah. And, this is one of the playoff debates that's going to come over the next couple of years, because the Big 12 is structured a little bit different than the SEC and the Big 10. The SEC and the Big 10 are going to gobble up 8 to 9 playoff spots.
100%.
But they're going to want all of them. They're going to want all 7 of those at-large bids. They're not going to want to share with the Big 12. They're not going to want to share with the ACC. They're certainly not going to want to share a second group of 5 team. So that's going to be part of this debate. And then when you see West Virginia or Utah or whoever with that 3 seed, we're going to watch those quarterfinal games very closely. Because why are we giving that spot? That's going to come up sooner rather than later. So the Big 12 is going to be on the spot. Good thing is they're going to be in the playoff every year. But it's going to be under a microscope now. No matter who it is. I still think they're in better position as a conference to put up 2 playoff teams than the ACC would be.
Okay. And we might get into some of that then as we move here throughout this show. I then will ask you this as we kind of wrap up the WVU talk. You have WVU around 7 wins right now. Obviously, if things go right, certain games end up being wins that maybe you think are losses. Green does go from 52.9 to 60%, etc. The defense holds water. Then they could contend for a Big 12 title because the Big 12 champ is probably only going to have 1 or 2 games better than them, even if they end up in 6th or 7th. That's how much depth and how wide open it is. But what is the floor for you, and what could the floor look like? Like, they had that 9 1 year. They proved everybody wrong. People making jokes about them, saying they're a MAC team. Egg was on their face. But it's not like that was that long ago. And it's also not like 1 9-win season for a historic program is going to be good enough to make people forget about that and forget that it has now taken Neal Brown. This is going into year 6 to have a really solid, great year. He does have an extension off of that. It's a favorable one for the program, by the way, if you really dissect it. But what does the floor look like? And is it out of the realm of possibility that we're sitting here next year, Neal Brown has been fired, and they won 4 games, and 2023 means nothing, and they got to fix it all over again?
4 games would be the floor. There are 10 games on this schedule that they could lose.
That'd be really bad. I mean, that would be what I'm saying. I think a 4-win season, Bren would have to discuss Brown again.
So if you look, and that's kind of how I break down schedules, is how many games could they lose? And if this is me saying, I'm saying there's 2 games that they're absolutely going to win. That's Albany. They're not going to lose to Albany. Okay. And I don't think they're going to lose at Cincinnati. Okay. I think Cincinnati's in a little bit of a bad spot.
2 dubs. Okay.
The rest of those games, you could make a case that they could lose, however flimsy. You make it, you could say, okay, they could lose that game. So 4-8 to me, if you say it's all 10, they're still going to win a couple. 4-8 would be the floor, and then you're getting into some weird conversations there because all of that momentum they built last year would be gone. And that's the Big 12. When every week you're like, I'm sitting here looking at their schedule. Yeah, Iowa State could be a game. The Iowa State could get weird. They've got a good quarterback. Have to go out to Tucson. Have they ever gone out to Tucson for a game? Probably going to be hot. Down the stretch, Baylor and UCF come to Morgantown. Those are favorable. And then at Texas Tech, I mean, I've watched enough games.
Texas Tech is always up in the air with WVU. That no matter what those seasons are, they always play them. They always play them tough. And and Baylor and UCF, they did beat them last year on the road. So it's hard to beat these programs back-to-back years, even though the rosters are changing. The coaches know each other. You got film. WVU at least is similar in style with most of the key contributors back, so they can watch the same game from last year and scheme for this year's team. Yeah. But again, 4 wins would be doomsday. That would make 2023 almost irrelevant in the grand scheme of things, would likely lead to a lot of transfers leaving if they have eligibility left. I do think if you look at the restructuring of Brown's contract, despite it being an extension in literal purposes, it does really reduce his buyout. He reduced his buyout, made it easier for the program. He wins 4 games only. He probably is gone despite 2023, even with more years left on the deal. I don't think Ren Baker would mess around and would go. I mean, at minimum, they got to be a bowl team, I think, for that program. So that probably is where kind of you compromise and say, I'm going to project 6-7, and that's where you get them right now in the guaranteed rate pool. The schedule is brutal, and it could include some out-of-conference losses. It could include one to Penn State, which we'll get to later, but it also could include one, which I think would sting more. There's more of a rivalry there, and again, Pitt is not expected to do all that much coming into this year, and that is the Pitt Panthers. So, talking with Bill Bender here on Mic Drop, I am now going to transition into the Pitt Panthers. They are a program that after a decade ago when everyone was realigned, West Virginia went from their glory days to kind of dipping back. 15 conference titles, but they're still looking for 16. They have not won one in the Big 12. Pitt did win one in the ACC. They did have a Heisman candidate in Kenny Pickett, but that also feels like eons ago because since then, they have puttered a little away the momentum they built. They got 1 bowl win after that. They won a Sun Bowl, but then last year, a 3-win season, one of the worst years in Pitt history, really. Expectations were there coming into the season. Their transfer QB and Phil Jerkovic, a local product, went from someone that people were buying hype into to basically losing them the brawl single-handedly and ending the year as a tight end. it could not have went worse for the Pitt Panthers. They entered this season with a lot of people feeling like 5 wins is the ceiling. They're going to be bad again. They do play West Virginia. They also have some tough games, but their schedule's not as brutal as maybe going into other years. Some do think the schedule could potentially get them into bowl eligibility, but it seems like that's the ceiling for most. What are your thoughts on Pitt and just your overall thoughts? We've been talking here for several years. What's kind of happened to this program? They did the opposite of West Virginia. West Virginia is building up from the mud and trying to climb. Pitt was at the mountain peak and has slowly fell off that peak to now they're trying to dust the mud off and get respectability again.
Right. In an ACC that is every bit as wide open in some ways, albeit with they had made inroads at, that conference revolves around Clemson and Florida State. It's the biggest difference between the ACC and the Big 12 is the Big 12's 2 monster brands are gone now. And I think if you've pulled the schools in the Big 12, they'd be like, that's fine. Whereas the ACC, that's fine. The Texas and Oklahoma are gone. We're cool.
That's what they say too. And there is a benefit because you could do what West Virginia's thing and win the conference that doesn't have the mega brands in there, and then you're in the playoff. There's a positive spin on it, but you don't have the 2 behemoths.
Right. And now Pitt, still has to deal with Clemson and Florida State. In fact, they got to play Clemson. Florida State's not on the schedule this year, and they're going to get a taste of this new ACC where you have to check the card and see Stanford and Cal. I believe they've got Cal and SMU. So there's going to be a couple surreal moments on the schedule this year where Pitt's down at SMU on November 2nd in Dallas for a conference game. I don't think anybody at Pitt pictured that when they came into the conference. But quarterback play last year, 17 touchdowns, 12 interceptions.
God,
that's when I break down quarterback situations with college teams, it's the first stat I look at. How many touchdowns? And it's such a basic stat, Mike, but how many touchdowns they throw? How many interceptions they throw? That gives you kind of a clue of how well that's going.
Yeah. And to flip West Virginia flipping versus what Pitt was doing, you mentioned Pitt stat being so bad. West Virginia, just on Garrett Green alone, 16 TDs, 4 picks. So that stat flipped back to the positive end and then some for the Mountaineers, which is how they won 9 games. But there's a lot of question marks still around Pitt. There's question marks at quarterback play again. There's question marks on defense again. There's question marks on weaponry again. There's question marks on the offensive line again. We've been talking about Neil Brown and his job security. Wins 9, but another bad season could have him back on the hot seat, if not get fired. How much longer does this go for Pat Narduzzi? Can he live off of the ACC crown when now it's not like they're going from an ACC title to they did win a bowl after that to 6 wins, at least get into a bowl game respectability, and then get back up to 7-8. To go from the ACC title, a bowl win, and then 2 years later, where you're not even in the conversation by Thanksgiving. Like their season was over when turkey was on our plate.
Right.
That shouldn't happen in that quick of a drop off, even with the transfer portal. How much longer do you think Narduzzi can do that? If they win 4 games this year, is he on a hot seat?
Probably a little, but I think, this is year 10 and you do the math on 65 and 50, he basically gives you 7 and 5 every year. Last year could be looked at as a blip, 3 and 9, and the bottom did fall out. It fell off on the defensive side. And that's something we were just talking about where, 0 and 7 when allowing 24 points or more in an offensive game. This is an offensive game. You got to score points and you're going to give up points. But when you get in those shootouts, you got to win them. And the quarterback play was an issue. You mentioned there's a young offensive line there that didn't really go into the transfer portal. I think they only have 1 transferred offensive lineman on their 2 deep. So that'll have to improve. Right? So all of these things are real issues for them. And I think, you get into that league schedule early. Rivalry games, Cincinnati, West Virginia, Youngstown State. That's a game they'll win, but
they could start out hot. I mean, they could beat West Virginia, and if they beat West Virginia, they could be 3-0 to start a year.
Yeah, 3-0 or 4-0 going into North Carolina, who's a team that faces similar questions
and they just
going down to their season.
Their star quarterback, so they're kind of in a little bit of a flux. But it could kind of be the opposite of what we talked about with West Virginia, where they could start out slow and they could benefit from an easier schedule at the end. Pitt could literally be 3 or 4-0 and then have the bottom fall off. I mean, they could go 3, 4, 5 wins in that first month and a half of the season and still only end up with 7. It's possible when you look at the latter half of the schedule. And that also makes me wonder, kind of, with the schedule kind of easier at the start, West Virginia could be a winnable game. They are at home, even though the Mountaineers are coming off a better year. Why do you think so many of our colleagues around the country are saying this is only a 4 or 5 win team when the schedule's not as brutal as it's been in recent years? You mentioned Florida State not there. Even if you get trounced by some of the top dogs, they still, off the schedule, unless they lose all of the swing games, should probably be a bowl team.
Yeah, I put them in a bowl game. A Holiday Bowl.
I did see you had them there, yeah.
Holiday Bowl, which is probably a little higher, but again, that we don't know how they shuffle these teams into these ACC bowls. So yeah, I think they'll get to a bowl game. I think they'll get to 6 or 7 wins, maybe 8 even with this schedule.
Okay.
And then you get into the second half of the season, though, it's SMU will not be. I know I made light of that game. That's not going to be an easy game.
No.
SMU could toss it around. Clemson, tough game at Pitt. Louisville, obviously, has taken some major steps. Yep. So, to me, it's the defense again. It was kind of the same question I was talking about the secondary. I think for Pitt, they got to allow fewer points. Their secondary is has a little more experience in it. I know I mentioned last time I was on here, Rasheem Biles, Pickerington kid, where I'm at. He's doing well. He's one of those kids that can play. So I think they can continue to build off that and hopefully be a little bit better on that side of the ball. But you mentioned Narduzzi. I don't see him as a hot seat guy. I think he's been there. He's established. Okay. He's won an ACC championship, and they can live off that for a little bit longer.
Yeah, I will tell you, though, in the market that I could definitely see another really bad year having fans certainly leave Narduzzi again, because you have to remember, prior to the ACC title, he was very polarizing. And I'm talking, when I say prior, earlier that year. Right. That season, the reason they won the ACC with Kenny Pickett as a Heisman candidate. However, as you know, earlier in that year, the reason why, despite winning the conference, they were never really in the conversation for the playoff when it was still only a 4-team playoff, is because they had a really bad group of 5 loss earlier in that season, where despite Pickett throwing TDs, their defense just was god-awful. Narduzzi, a defensive guy. At that point, many Pitt fans, even those who were high on him before, wanted him fired. We're giving all the offensive credit to Mark Whipple, who I can report him and Mark Whipple didn't have the best relationship, which is why Mark Whipple, kind of was gone after that year. That can be blamed on Narduzzi when the defense continues to lose players and be worse. That's on him. And then the offense cannot replace what was lost, despite obviously being award winners. If they do it all again, and now we're 3 years removed from the ACC title, the people that believe that it was Mark Whipple helping Pickett and that the ACC championship was an aberration, they would have a lot more venom to bring up.
Right. Yeah. And certainly going to be fair, because like you said, the schedule is not as difficult as it should be or could be, because there's no Miami, there's no Florida State. Those are the 2 teams that are going to be conventionally favored to play in the ACC championship game this year. It is the ACC. I don't know that it's a little more wide open, but I could see that criticism, and fair point, because I do remember the temperature around Narduzzi before Kenny Pickett and that team broke through and did what they did.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that was not that long ago. These years go by very, very quickly, and the rosters change. And it also speaks to the portal vibe that always sets the offseason. The Mountaineers had players leaving, had an exodus of players leaving. That's why the vibe was so bad. Then they go 5-7, and that's why the pressure was there. Pitt, everyone was staying. Everything was great. They won a conference title. But this past offseason, or this current offseason, players leaving, players departing, not much coming in. The ones who came in a couple off seasons ago now did not work clearly. And those, Phil Jerkovic again was somebody that Narduzzi thought was going to work, and then again made a tight end a few months later. So that is not a good vibe. And you would have to figure, even though a lot of it is about money where players go and opportunity, that if they have another 4 or 5 win, a miss bowl type of season, that should lead to more players leaving. players with eligibility looking elsewhere because the vibes are just not good. And sometimes that can get this ball rolling on what the offseason looks like. So a very important season, I would imagine, for the Pitt program, that I would say a bowl game would at least get them back on the right track. They don't have the pressure of trying to win a conference title like, say, West Virginia does this year. If they do, it would be a big bonus. But I don't think anyone's thinking that. But if they get 6 or 7, okay, we're on the right track. Next year, again, maybe we vie for the ACC again. But if it's 3-4 wins again, they may stick with Narduzzi, as you're saying, because he's been there so long. He did win a conference title. That is rare throughout Pitt program history. And he's really a Pitt lifer. Like he really is entrenched into Pitt, and he's been in rumors. He's not gone anywhere. But I could see the fan base turning on him, and then we'll see how much longer it goes with Heather Lyke dealing with the fan base having turned on the program, because if that goes 2 or 3 more years, they could start turning on her. We will see. A lot of pressure is on Pitt right now. Talking with Bill Bender here of the Sporting News on Mic Drop, as we are talking college football, talked the Mountaineers in the Big 12. We talked Pitt in the ACC, and we are now going to shift gears and talk Penn State in the Big 10, the new look Big 10. And I will open up by saying, in terms of pressure, and a lot of it is on West Virginia, but in terms of pressure, I would say by far the most, if not maybe the most pressure of any program in the whole country, you could argue, is on Penn State. It's a 12-team playoff now. You do the math and look at the last 10 years. If it was 12-team the last 10 years in 2014, they would have been in about half the time. And that's not the reality for the program the last 10 years. They have not been in. They've clearly been the third best Big Ten program at best behind Ohio State and Michigan, certainly in recent years. There are a lot of Penn State fans saying, yeah, 10 wins seems doable again. That should at least contend for everything. But if you go to 10 wins and you lose the games you're supposed to lose, but you win all the games you're supposed to win, like they've been doing with losing to Ohio State, losing to Michigan, and beating everybody else, what am I getting excited about? It seems like there's a ceiling there on Penn State. What do you expect from the Nittany Lions this year? And what needs to happen to literally break through that glass ceiling, contend actually for a playoff spot, maybe win the Big Ten as it's much bigger than it was, and not have that conversation be the January, February talk every year around Franklin that, okay, yeah, a lot of wins, you're beating teams you're supposed to beat, but when it's you in a swing game, like you're mentioning, these are the important games, or you're actually the underdog, you lose every time.
Yeah, that's the question. I think the good news is
that's the debate. That's the both sides on Franklin right now.
Right. Like they would have been in the playoff 5 times the last 10 years. They had a really good team that played out in the Rose Bowl against USC that would have been a dangerous team in a 12-team format.
Yeah, you never know once you get in, right?
They really struggled with Michigan and Ohio State, but Jim Harbaugh's gone now. Michigan, I don't know where that's going to go. I still think they're going to be good this year, but I don't know long-term with Sharon Moore how that's going to work out.
Okay.
I know Ohio State's the standard, and Penn State's
sure.
I don't know. I think this is correct. But if you take away the last 2 years in the last decade, Penn State's been more of a problem for Ohio State than Michigan, with the exception of the last before.
Yeah, Michigan had down years. People do forget that, right?
Pre-COVID,
Harbaugh was on the hot seat.
Post-COVID, that's changed because Michigan obviously has come out and won 3 in a row and did it in a brutal fashion by just
COVID is the switch there. COVID happened and Michigan became elite again, right?
Right, like they did it in true Harbaugh fashion. They just plowed through the Big Ten the last 3 years. So, you look at Penn State on one hand, the schedule's set up very favorably for them as far as this new Big Ten goes. They go out to USC. That's going to be tough. They got UCLA, Ohio State at home. They got a tough trip to Wisconsin, but that's a 10-win schedule if things break right. 9 wins if it doesn't. So they should be in the 12-team playoff. They James Franklin will face a lot of pressure if this 18-team they get lost in the shuffle of this 18-team Big Ten.
Because even not winning the Big Ten, as we talked about earlier, this is not the Big 12 ACC issue where you got to win the conference to know you're in for sure. In the Big Ten and the SEC, and for good reason because they're stacked with so many elite programs, Penn State could be third best or fourth best in the conference like they've been and should still probably get in the playoff. Like they do what they have to do in conference play like they've been. They should get into the playoff. However, They may even be able to do it with, and this happened last year with West Virginia being better than people thought on the out-of-conference schedule. Their out-of-conference schedule and overall win-loss record and overall style points for AP votes, etc., might look a little bit better if the Mountaineers end up doing what they did last year. This is going into the game. So if they beat West Virginia handily on the road and West Virginia wins 8 games or 9 games again, that would quiet the you can only win home out-of-conference games, and your other out-of-conference games aren't tough because you play Delaware and Villanova, etc., and West Virginia was at home last year. If they go into Morgantown and beat a team that just won 9 and is believing they can win the Big 12, and they trounce the Big 12 possible champ, or even if West Virginia ends up as 5th, 6th, or 7th, but a good team, that would go far in getting Penn State real recognition, even if they don't win the Big 10. So they have it in front of them. But the other end of that is, Bill, if West Virginia is what West Virginia says, and somehow Penn State loses that game, even if it's on the road, and then they don't win the Big 10, then you're looking at that's almost the doomsday scenario for Penn State. They probably still would win 8 games at minimum because of the schedule, but that's, I think, where the Nittany Lion fan would sit there and say, this is worse than it's been. This is bad. Like, now they would be out on Franklin. And again, I'm not saying he would get fired, but that would probably where those conversations would rev up. And that's week 1 if they would lose that out-of-conference game. Can you imagine the rest of the year in that conversation if they would drop that game in Morgantown?
Yeah, I mean, it would not be good because they have, for all the struggles against Ohio State and Michigan, they've been pretty good in the rest of them under at least recently. And, I was at the Ohio State game last year where literally the difference between the two teams was one had Marvin Harrison, the other didn't. And that's why Ohio State won that game. And in these last 2 years, they've literally, the regular season, it's Ohio State and Michigan. Michigan, I thought the Michigan loss for Penn State last year was embarrassing.
It was worse because they weren't, they got 30 straight run plays. They weren't even in the game.
The second half was embarrassing from an offensive standpoint, from a play call standpoint at some points in the game, and just being able to let Michigan beat them literally. And I think Michigan on some level did it on purpose.
No, they were trolling them. I mean, again, we're talking literally 30 straight run plays. They were making a mockery of Penn State, 100%. Right.
And they did that and so for Penn State, I think this will be a big year for Drew Aller. I like his build.
I was gonna bring up Drew Aller. Yeah,
he's numbers are good.
Yeah,
but against ranked teams, he did not play well. And
I hear from a lot of colleagues around the country, why is Drew Aller not as good as advertised? Or what do you think of Drew Aller? I don't think he's that good. It seems like the whole conversation around Drew Aller at this point last year was great recruit. He's going to be the savior. He's the best Penn State talent-wise at quarterback in a while, even though they won a lot of games with players they didn't think as much of. And now it's shifted to the national conversation around Aller is that he's a disappointment. And it's off of just the big-time games you're mentioning. Right. Numbers were there against WVU and everybody else, but against Michigan and Ohio State, they were not, and they lost, and they weren't really in those games. And unfortunately, unlike the other programs we've been discussing, Penn State is literally going to be judged their entire year on 2 or 3 games.
Right. And they didn't have the talent on the outside to have great games in those games. You know what I mean? They didn't have the perimeter talent. Their running game's good. Singleton and Allen that's good.
Is that not a recruiting issue? Is that Penn State's problem that they cannot be Ohio State and Michigan? Because many have argued they are not recruiting wide receivers very well the last 5 years, including even transfers. Devin Carter actually flipped from Penn State to West Virginia. I don't think much of him, but they lost Rodney Gallagher. The point of it is the top wide receiver recruits, whether it be in high school or the portal in each given year, are not going to Penn State. And I will tell you, they are offering those kids. Yeah, Why are they not getting them?
Well, and some of it's development too. I mean, Michigan developed Roman Wilson. Michigan doesn't get 5-star receivers. They haven't. They're decent, but they're not like Cornelius Johnson made the NFL. But that was the difference to me. It was Penn State didn't have it on the perimeter last year. Ohio State did. Ohio State always does. Defenses were comparable. Quarterbacks were actually comparable. Really, you flip Kyle McCord and Drew Aller, you probably have 2 different narratives on those 2 quarterbacks last year.
Probably.
Running backs about the same. Offensive line, I mean, they had Olu. Olu was a first-round pick. Yeah. Their offensive line was fine. Every position group was close except receiver. So
tight end's probably been an advantage for Penn State in recent years. It's just receiver, and Marvin Harrison obviously is an all-world. Penn State hasn't had that guy or really even depth.
And Chop got hurt. Chop got hurt in that game. So I mean, they're not that far off. And I just think not having Michigan on the schedule is going to help. Not having to be locked into one rival. I know that was a topic of conversation where they don't have a protected rival.
Yeah.
And that's going to work out because
a lot of fans think that's an insult, but it might work out. Yeah.
I'm an Ohio guy, so I don't like that they don't play Ohio State every year.
Okay.
Because they've been doing it for 30 years. It's produced 10 classic games at least. And that's the one I don't like that they're not going to play every year. But I think Ohio State fans are actually more hung up on that than Penn State fans are.
Yeah. And again, you got to take advantage of those important games. USC, I think, is another one that is important just for the fact that USC has been a little disappointing the last couple of years, and that's probably a swing game too. You lose that, again, then the fans could argue you were third best in the old Big Ten. Now that we got new boys coming in, where are you? Because there are other some of these are historic programs that are coming in that usually can churn top recruits, like, again, USC being one of those. It's not like it's going to be easy adding more teams and more programs to the conference, and the recruiting base is now certainly all over the country. So Penn State has some important games there beyond just the two that are always important. Yeah, you get one off the schedule this year, but this is an important year for Penn State. How do you perceive the James Franklin era and the tenure for James Franklin? Because as we're talking, a lot of it is 10-win seasons, a couple Rose Bowl appearances. They did win one, but it's not been more than that. And the Penn State fan, if you look at top 15 recruiting classes every year, believes they should be Michigan and Ohio State every year like they've been the last few years. But Penn State has clearly felt like a notch below.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there's a path to get over that unless they start recruiting differently and getting the Marvin Harrisons, and they're not coming. They didn't do it again this year. So that's another recruiting class. They don't have a premier receiver again. Is there a path to get out of that? And how do you look at the James Franklin tenure?
8 straight seasons they've been in the top 10 at some point in the year. And they finished in the top 10 4 times.
Pretty good.
So we can't say, I mean, you could do without real quick, so in terms of coming into the program at the point after O'Brien, we don't have to rehash everything that happened there. Right. I don't want to, honestly.
No, we're not going to, but it was tough to take the job then. Sure.
Right. And to come into those circumstances and do the things that he's done. Yeah, that's been a success. He's 112 and 54, but it's those top 10. It's the top 10 tagline that needs to change. So you've had time. That the recruiting's good. He's got good people around the program. They've produced a ton of NFL talent. They've been in memorable games. And this 12-team era is built for guys like James Franklin. You should be in the playoff. Maybe you can make a run.
They got to get in the playoff. At least, certainly, if not next year, the year after that.
They got to be in the playoff one of these 2 years, or it's going to get really uncomfortable in Happy Valley for him, despite all of those upgrades. I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah, and a lot of fans are going to even say this coming season, but I think to be generous, it got to certainly be within this 2 year period before it probably gets tinkered again. Like, they got to get in one of those, because when you should have been in 5 the last decade, you weren't because of the format. You can't complain about the format if then you're not in when they change the format to benefit you. So yeah, there's absolute pressure on Penn State for sure, on James Franklin, and just knowing him too, I could certainly see that if they keep missing the playoff, they don't do anything more than they've been doing recruiting. Like, it doesn't go from top 15 to top 5, and the energy gets real negative. Maybe he's going to want to take a step back, or maybe he's going to want to take another job, or he's still young. His career won't be over, but all good things, maybe all relationships eventually do come to an end. That almost feels like that would then needing to be everyone part ways, because there'd be a lot of angst there. So a lot of pressure on Penn State. Again, I do feel like they are a program that maybe has arguably the most pressure of any in the country to get in the playoff now, since they have vocally, even Franklin said this in press conferences, like, they're selling the fact they should have been in, and there always should have been a 12-team playoff. it's going to be hard to sell that if they don't get in. Now there is a 12-team playoff, so it is in front of them, but a lot of pressure on James Franklin, a lot of pressure on Drew Aller, and a lot of pressure on Penn State for sure. So we talked about these programs here. I do maybe want to get a national look from you as well. Can you give me a program that is not talked about enough that you think could be a surprise breakout program this year? And what I mean by that is what TCU did a couple years ago, what people thought Colorado was going to do last year, but they did not, and they fell off. A team that is not on really any of your colleagues' projections to win a conference, but very definitely could in your eyes.
I think Kansas State could win the Big 12. They're the one that I kind of have circled. They've got the tough ones at home. They've got Oklahoma State at home. They do have to play West Virginia, obviously. They like their quarterback. It's telling to me that Will Howard left, and that's fine with them. Watch them in the bowl game, the Pop-Tarts Bowl. They played very well. They're physical up front. Pop-Tarts Bowl took over the postseason, obviously. And their defensive guys came back. So that's always an indicator for me. When you have a program where you see like 4 or 5 guys come back. Washington was that program a year ago.
Washington would be right. Yes.
Right. Like they had several guys come back. So you're like, okay, that locker room saying we're going to go do this year. And it doesn't always work out. It's not perfect, but I think they're one of those teams they're in the top 25 and we know who they are. They played Alabama in a Sugar Bowl a couple years ago and it didn't go well, but they're around. And I think they're one in the Power 4 to watch. A lot of people like Miami, Mike, and I'm not as high on that because I know how that's
been the sexy pick every freaking year. And it just never comes to fruition.
Right. So I'm not as on board with that, but I do know that they have Cam Ward. They've got some talent on both sides as they normally do. Also know they've only won 10 games one time since Larry Coker retired.
That's what I'm saying. But they were predicted to do so about 8 other times. They continuously underachieve. And obviously there's tons of talent there, and they still do well in recruiting. I think that's why people try to always eventually say they're going to be back, because you look at these recruiting ranks, and it's either we all don't know what we're talking about in recruiting, or they're messing up something in the season or coaching-wise, or something's going on. But they are continuously underachieving with talent there. But that is absolutely a program to bring up that could at any time break out again and be a problem for years to come. But until they do, it's hard for me to slurp the Kool-Aid because it's just continuously 7-6 win seasons, and they're supposed to win 9 or 10. Yeah, and they've proven it for a decade plus. They can, but not in this era.
They got some guys on that defense that are going to play at the next level, and they brought it. They have five or six transfers on the 2 deep that are going to play significant as usual. And Mario knows how to recruit a little bit, but I mean, I can't get. And last year, I'll be fair, they were being seen as a playoff sleeper until they had that disastrous finish against Georgia Tech, and then it kind of unraveled from there. So it is a team that has some talent. It is a team that could push into that top tier of the ACC, but I'm kind of at the point where I'm like, I got to see them do it. I'm not going to say that. You can't say that they're going to do it every year. And then, I was right. Well, yeah, you tried 10 times.
Yeah, it's like people that fill out a March Madness, like 10, 15 March Madness brackets, and they're like, well, on my good one, I got it right. But I didn't predict this team to do anything the other 12, brackets I filled out. Yeah, like I got to see it before I can really buy them. And it doesn't make sense because what happened 8 years ago is not this year. But they just been doing the same thing regardless of who's the head coach for a long time now. And again, everyone slurps the Kool-Aid. They then have that game that you're mentioning. They're always a playoff dark horse until one game we all sit down and watch and say, oh my God, they're losing by 20 to that team.
Right.
They lose, and then they don't rebound well. It's not like they have that game and then turn it on. That game always means the unraveling. They lose that game they shouldn't lose, and the next week they lose again. They lose again. And then you're looking at, well, they lost 5 times already. They're clearly well out of the conversation now. So that's like always the life of Miami football here the last decade. When will it change? I don't know. I do want to ask you, and many are saying Washington could be kind of this team, even though they're going to be good, but they're not going to do what they did last year. You mentioned they were the sleeper last year that got in the national championship game and was that close. Is there a team that was really good last year or has been really good that is going to maybe take that drop off, do what happened to West Virginia prior to last year for the better part of Neil Brown's tenure, what happened to Pitt last year where they went to 3 wins after being a conference contender the prior 2 years. Is there that program that usually is in these talks that you just think this is going to be an historically bad year, or could be they're going to be out of it early on?
Washington obviously is going to have some up and downs with how much they lost and Jed Fish coming in. And I like that hire for losing Kalen, how they did. I mean, all 3 of those schools that were impacted there after the playoff. There's 3 playoff schools we're talking about. Washington, there's going to be a transition. Michigan with Sharon Moore, and the schedule that they have is going to be rough. And they don't have quarterback figured out yet. And anytime you lose, any program loses 13 guys in the NFL, there's going to be a step back. I think Michigan is okay this year because they have enough back on the defense that they're going to, and a lot of their tough games are at home, but they'll be a step back. And Alabama is the one, I'm kind of going the other direction. Yes, there will be a step back from the greatest coach of all time. That's not a bold prediction. Nick Saban's the greatest college football coach ever.
Right.
But I'm kind of coming back toward Kalen can coach too. And they've got enough talent around there and some new ideas on offense that'll probably work.
Depends on what you think of step back. Like, if they don't win the SEC, their fans are going to say, well, this is the darkest time when that's not reality.
Right. Yeah. I still think they have a playoff team though. And then we go from there with that. So the expectations will have to change in Tuscaloosa one way or the other. But those are 3 that will be monitored really closely as far as how it goes after making the playoff last year. Who knew that of the 4 playoff teams last year, we get into 2024 and Texas is probably on the most stable ground?
Yeah, because they were the Miami before they finally kind of came back a little bit, where they would get picked every year and they would disappoint, and the whole I'm back or we're back, it didn't happen. So we'll see what they do in the SEC. It's going to certainly be tougher for Texas and Oklahoma to win conference titles than it was. But as we're talking, maybe it's not as important if they get in the playoff and they're still making tons of money. You'll probably be able to get in as one of 5, 6 teams from your conference now, whereas before they had to win a conference title probably to get in. But how many trophies they hold up might be less. We will see. A lot of pressure on those programs to be respectable. If either one of them has a 7-win year in their first year of the SEC, they're going to have a rough offseason because they made this decision, and now it's looking like it's really hurting you on the field. We will see. It's a tougher conference. I don't think even people in the Big 12 would deny that, of what they're dealing with now in terms of depth in the SEC. But I think for Bama, they probably are a playoff team. Even if they don't win the SEC, they're probably still a playoff team for sure. The doomsday for them would be falling back into the prior to Nick Saban tenure, where they're getting 7-win seasons and they kind of became an average program and people forgot about the history of the program. They did have a period there for a decade where they weren't Alabama prior to Saban. If they do that again, which is kind of what's been happening to some other historic program, like Nebraska's not been able to dig back to what they were in the 90s for 20 years now. Tennessee had that great year recently, but prior to that, it took a while. If they do that, which is what happened to some other major programs, a lot of other issues are going on with them. That, I think, is where the Bama fan is scared, because that also gives the credit to Saban resurrected it and made it Bama again. If you believe Saban's the GOAT and he resurrected it and made it Bama again, he's not there, but the talent is, and they should keep on recruiting, and there's still a lot of money there. So I don't think that'll necessarily happen, but are they going to go undefeated? Probably not. Are they going to win national title? Probably not. But that doesn't mean, a playoff appearance, even if they don't win the conference, it's going to be hard. Some will argue this, but it's going to be hard to say that's just on Saban leaving. You could even argue if they do that, that's what Saban's been doing the last couple of years. I mean, there's been a little bit of a dip the last few years of Saban from what it was when they were clipping off national titles every year as well. They were on the fringe of the playoff. Granted, those fringe spots would be getting in now in a 12-team playoff. Bill, I appreciate the time for sure. I'm also sure you're going to have more bowl projections, more of your predictions. A lot of this is cyclical and going to change, as we're talking here early July. So anyone freaking out saying Bill got me in the guaranteed rate bowl, next week maybe you're being a better bowl. You never know where all these things are going to work. And if you find yourself in 2 bowls, then maybe enjoy 2 bowl games in
exactly.
Bill Bender's world.
Thanks for having me on. It was a lot of fun. And at Sporting News, we'll have plenty of media day, conference championship stuff, our preseason All-American team. And, I appreciate talking to you in this spot. And I know we'll definitely catch up during the regular season.
For sure. Definitely have you back here as we get close to the regular season, touch on all of this and then more, and then maybe even into the regular season for sure. And I won't ask you now because we're still early on. But at that point, maybe I'll ask you for your national champion pick. I'll narrow you down on the playoff teams. We'll get into some individual awards. If you buy into some thinking Garrett Green could somehow get in the Heisman conversation if West Virginia wins the Big 12, which I don't think you are, nor am I. But we'll see. We'll narrow ourselves down to any of that as we get close to the season. But enjoy the rest of your summer, even though
what's
hard
left
covering. With what's left of it and covering this sport, you basically don't get one because now everyone's thinking about the fall and we're in July. But I appreciate the time, Bill. Have a good day.
Hey, no problem. Thank you.
Bill Bender of the Sporting News. Always love talking to him. He really dives into this whole thing as we talk West Virginia, Pitt, and Penn State all through the region here that I cover. Expectations, what could go right, what could go wrong, even some national conversation there on this edition of Mic Drop. We're going to have him on again to touch more about all of this as well, because obviously a lot of this could change, and he's going to throw a lot more predictions and get more into this as the months go by here into the summer. But I wanted to kind of touch base now because I felt a month ago it was way too damn early, and I want to see a month from now where we are off of this show and what changes at that point when you then get into fall camp and these rosters are really set and you're back on campus and we're getting really into the thick of things when July switches into August. Make sure to download and subscribe to this and every episode of Mic Drop. Again, Mic Drop is powered by the Believe Network, available everywhere you get your podcasts, Apple, Google Play, TuneIn, etc. Also, some of these Believe shows and Mic Drop is part of that, or available occasionally on Sirius XM channels. Thanks again to Bill of the Sporting News. Find his work over there, and you can also find him on X and on social. Let me get it at BillBender92 on X and everywhere on social media as well. So we are now a month or so away from fall camp. We're still far from the season, but not really. Enjoy your summer while you can, because a lot of us are already focused on what's going to happen in the fall.